The email didn't come from the HOA president. It came from the architecture committee. Subject line: Driveway compliance review. Action required. That alone wasn't unusual. Over the past few months, the HOA had quietly circulated a few minor policy updates about frontage consistency and visual clutter management. Nothing targeted. More like general reminders. So, at first, I assumed this was another routine check. But when I opened the attachment, I stopped. It wasn't a reminder. It was a formal review file. My driveway was shown in a photo taken from the street, and my truck was circled in red. Under it, a note read, "Subject vehicle flagged during frontage visibility audit under updated architectural guidelines." That wording changed everything. This wasn't coming out of nowhere. It referenced an updated guideline review cycle I hadn't paid attention to, apparently already approved internally. There was no mention of towing, no fines, no violation notice, just a directive: submit a correction plan. I walked outside and looked at the truck. It hadn't moved in a few days. Nothing unusual. Between assignments, it stayed parked fully within my driveway. Nothing blocked the sidewalk. Nothing extended into the street. Still, the angle in the photo made it look different. More exposed than it felt in person. Later that afternoon, I replied with a short explanation. Temporary staging, fully contained on private property, no operational activity. The response came the next morning. The committee confirmed the vehicle fell under the updated frontage visibility review category and required mitigation, relocation, screening, or modification. No deadline, no penalties, just a final line. Failure to comply may result in formal architectural review escalation. That was the first time I realized this wasn't a complaint. It was the system beginning to apply a new standard, retroactively. The truck itself wasn't unusual, at least not mechanically. It was a medium-duty utility vehicle I used for contract-based field support, mostly storage modules, portable lighting, and communication equipment that changed depending on the job. Nothing restricted. Nothing specialized in a way that required oversight. Between assignments, it stayed parked at home. The driveway was wide enough, and until recently, there had never been any issue. The HOA had always focused more on aesthetics than function. Paint colors, fencing styles, landscaping consistency. But that changed quietly. A few months earlier, the HOA circulated an updated architectural visibility guideline. It didn't single anything out, but it introduced new language about frontage exposure, consistency, and shared visual alignment standards. At the time, it seemed like a vague policy refresh, easy to ignore. Now I realized that document was the starting point. The review email wasn't random. It was the first formal application of that update. Still, I didn't understand why my property was the first to be flagged. There had been no complaint filed directly against me, at least none that I had been informed about. The HOA didn't reference a neighbor or incident either. Only a frontage audit observation conducted under the revised guidelines. So I started retracing the situation myself. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the property again, looking at it from different angles. From the street entrance, the truck was partially visible between landscaping gaps. From the cul-de-sac bend, it appeared more centered than I expected. From my own driveway perspective, it felt completely normal, just parked, inactive, routine. That difference between how it looked and how it was seen kept bothering me. I considered whether this was triggered by someone's report or just an internal audit cycle. The HOA hadn't said either way, but the language suggested it came from an automated review pass rather than a direct complaint. Later that night, I received a second email. It clarified that the review was part of a property-wide frontage visibility assessment rollout, starting with selected addresses flagged during preliminary scanning under the new framework. That was the first clear indication this wasn't personal. It wasn't even reactive. It was procedural. and my property had simply been selected as one of the first cases where the new standard would be applied in practice. The first board response didn't feel urgent. It arrived as a short confirmation that my case had been placed into the next architectural review cycle under the updated frontage visibility guidelines. No rejection, no approval, just procedural acknowledgement. At that point, I still assumed this would be resolved like a normal compliance issue. Adjust something, resubmit photos, close the file. That assumption didn't last long. A week later, I received a formal board memo. It stated that my prior adjustment proposal had been reviewed and dismissed. The reason given was not placement, obstruction, or violation. It introduced a new classification entirely: persistent frontage dominance under shared approach visibility conditions. That phrase mattered more than the decision itself, because it meant the issue was no longer about where the truck was parked. It was about how the property was being interpreted, under a new evaluative lens. The next line in the memo marked the actual turning point. The board announced a policy escalation resolution had been passed in the Architectural Committee's quarterly session. I went back and read that sentence twice. A resolution, not a review, not a suggestion. A formal internal decision had been made to expand the guideline framework into a structured standard definition system, and my case had been selected as the foundation for it. That was the moment the process changed direction. Up until then, everything had been framed as evaluation. Now it was being reframed as construction. The memo explained the mechanism in formal terms. The Architectural Committee had voted to initiate a standardization protocol for frontage visibility interpretation, using selected case properties to define measurable thresholds for future assessments. My property was listed as one of those selected cases. Not because it violated rules, but because it represented an edge condition, something that exposed where the existing rules stopped being precise. I didn't fully understand what that meant at first, so I asked for clarification. The response was brief. The prior assessment cycle had identified inconsistencies in how visual dominance was being interpreted across inspectors. To address this, the board had authorized a framework development process to unify interpretation under measurable criteria. That explanation should have made it feel more controlled. Instead, it made it feel irreversible, because now every response I received followed a narrowing structure. Repositioning was deemed insufficient under the new interpretation model. Screening was marked as non-conclusive in shared approach contexts, and relocation was described as functionally outside framework relevance. Each option didn't just get rejected, it got reclassified as inadequate input for system definition. That was the first time I noticed the language shifting away from my property entirely. It wasn't asking what I would do anymore. It was using what I had done to define what others would be allowed to do. A few days later, I tried one more adjustment, rotating the truck deeper into the driveway and installing a temporary neutral screen along the edge. I documented everything and submitted updated images. The reply came later than usual. Short, finalizing in tone. Submitted configuration confirms boundary condition relevance. Case escalated to framework definition review per committee resolution. That line confirmed it. There was no returning to standard review anymore. A separate track had already been activated. And I wasn't being assessed for compliance. I was being used as input for rule creation. The board meeting wasn't labeled as urgent. Just a scheduled session titled Architectural Standardization Determination Hearing. That sounded procedural enough. But when I arrived at the community clubhouse, I immediately noticed the difference. The room was full. Not just board members, but homeowners, invited under what was described as an open policy observation provision. That alone changed the atmosphere. This wasn't just a review anymore. It was being observed. The first thing displayed on the screen was my driveway. Same image from earlier filings. No explanation. No introduction. Just the photo. A board member began speaking. They stated that my property had been identified during the escalation phase as a boundary condition case for frontage visibility interpretation. That phrasing immediately triggered questions from the room. So, this is about one driveway setting new rules? Someone asked. The board member responded carefully. This is not rule creation based on a single case. This is structured standardization based on observed inconsistencies requiring formal definition. Another homeowner leaned forward. So who approved turning this into a standard? That question changed the tone of the room. A pause followed. Then the board chair finally responded. A formal vote had been conducted in the architectural committee. The motion passed to initiate a framework adoption process for visibility measurement standardization, effective immediately. That was the first clear procedural anchor in the entire situation. A decision point. Not interpretation, not escalation. A recorded adoption step. That explained why everything felt different now. Because once that vote passed, the case was no longer being reviewed in isolation. It had entered a system-building phase. I tried to explain my position, that the vehicle had always been within property boundaries, that nothing had changed physically, only interpretation had shifted over time. But one board member interrupted calmly. The purpose of this phase is not dispute resolution. It is calibration of measurable definitions. That word again. Calibration. It didn't sound like enforcement anymore. It sounded like construction. The board then introduced what they called the reference designation protocol. They explained that certain properties, identified during the escalation phase, would be used to establish baseline visibility parameters under the new framework, and my property had been formally selected under that protocol, not arbitrarily, but through committee vote under the same resolution that initiated the framework. That detail mattered, because it meant this wasn't improvisation. It was authorized structure. Someone in the room asked the obvious question. What does it mean to be a reference property? The board didn't over-explain. They simply stated that reference properties would be used to define measurement thresholds for all future assessments under the visibility standard framework. There was no debate after that. The discussion shifted into diagrams, categories, and visibility scoring models. But I stopped focusing on that, because I realized something had already happened. The decision point wasn't in the room anymore. It had happened before I walked in, and everything now was just implementation of that earlier vote. After the meeting, I received the formal summary. It confirmed my property had been designated as a calibration reference case under adopted framework protocol, following committee resolution approval. No appeal process was mentioned. No review path remained, and that was the shift. My property was no longer being evaluated. It was being used to define how evaluation itself would function going forward. The week before the framework went live felt unusually still. No new emails. No clarification requests. No incremental feedback like before. It felt less like a pause and more like a system waiting to be released. Then the official document arrived. Subject line: Residential Visibility Compliance Framework, Final Adoption and Publication Notice. This time, it wasn't just an internal HOA file. It included an attached publication notice indicating the framework had been formally approved by the Architectural Committee and ratified by the HOA Board in a joint session, then prepared for community-wide distribution as a governing standard. That detail changed how I read everything that followed, because this wasn't just development anymore. It was adoption. The document itself was extensive. Structured definitions, measurement tables, exposure angle models, and standardized diagrams for frontage assessment. But what stood out wasn't the technical depth. It was the rollout section. The framework had gone through a formal implementation pathway. First, committee drafting based on escalation cases. Then, board-level approval of the standardized interpretation model. Then, formal publication as an active community guideline applicable to all residential properties under HOA jurisdiction. My property appeared in the appendix under a specific heading. Calibration application case. Approved reference standard. Not as a violation. Not as an exception. but as a finalized reference used during validation prior to publication. That meant my case wasn't just part of the framework. It had been used to finalize it before adoption, and now it was being distributed as part of the official rulebook. The language across the document had changed noticeably from earlier drafts I had seen. What was once described vaguely as visual dominance had now become a structured system of measurable components. Exposure ratios, shared sightline thresholds, and frontage alignment scores. The difference wasn't just clarity, it was permanence. Later that day, a community-wide notice went out confirming the framework's official publication and enforcement activation date. From that point forward, all properties would be assessed under the new visibility standard as part of routine architectural review cycles. That was the first time the change extended beyond my case in a visible way. Neighbors started reacting almost immediately. One showed me a printed report where his driveway was now segmented into labeled visibility zones with percentage scores. Another mentioned receiving a notice indicating compliance review under the newly published standard, not as a warning, but as a classification update. No one was being singled out anymore, because now everyone was being measured against the same published system, and that system had been formally activated through board approval and publication notice. There was no ambiguity left about whether it applied. It did. Fully. Uniformly. But my property still remained listed as the calibration reference in the final appendix. Not as a live case, but as the origin point used to define the measurement structure itself. That distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant I wasn't part of the rollout. I was part of what made the rollout possible, and once a system is published using a reference point, that reference stops being a participant in the process. It becomes part of the framework itself. A few days after the framework went live, the first shift didn't come from the HOA. It came from outside its jurisdiction. I received a notice from the Municipal Planning Coordination Office stating that the city had formally entered a data sharing and urban assessment agreement with multiple homeowners associations to support residential frontage and visibility analysis across suburban zones. Ours was listed as the recently adopted frameworks. At first, it sounded administrative, the kind of interagency coordination most residents would ignore. But then I saw the reference to the HOA document. The Residential Visibility Compliance Framework had been formally incorporated into a municipal-level planning evaluation model under that agreement. That meant the system was no longer confined to community governance. It had been adopted into a broader analytical structure used for urban development assessment. I went back and reread the notice carefully. The key detail wasn't just data sharing. It was authorization. The city had approved structured access to HOA-generated visibility classification data for use in planning evaluations related to zoning consistency and frontage categorization. That meant the framework wasn't just being observed. It was being integrated. My property appeared again in the documentation, but this time under a different classification. Reference frontage dataset entry used for suburban visibility modeling calibration. That wording changed everything again, because it removed the boundary between HOA interpretation and municipal planning analysis. I contacted the HOA office immediately for clarification. They confirmed that a formal interagency data exchange agreement had been executed, with municipal planning consultants following framework publication. According to them, this agreement allowed anonymized structural data derived from the visibility framework to be used in city-level residential planning models. When I asked whether individual properties could still be identified within that dataset, the response became less direct. They said the system used standardized anonymization protocols approved under municipal data governance policy, but they did not confirm the degree of reversibility between anonymized data and physical property identification. That gap stood out more than anything else, because it meant the boundary between model data and real property wasn't fully separated anymore. Later that week, I spoke again with the neighbor who had previously shown me his classification report. He mentioned receiving a zoning reassessment notice tied to updated frontage visibility bands referenced in a city planning update. At first, he treated it as unrelated administrative recalibration, but the terminology matched the framework exactly. Not similar. Identical. Still, there was no document explicitly connecting the HOA framework to taxation or zoning enforcement. No single transition point. Just layered systems referencing the same structure through different administrative channels. That was what made it difficult to trace, because there was no visible moment where the framework moved outward. It simply appeared in other systems already shaped by it. And as I reviewed everything again, HOA publication, municipal notice, classification reports, I couldn't find a clean separation anymore. The system hadn't expanded. It had synchronized. The next notice didn't feel like a continuation of anything. It felt like the system had moved past needing input. It arrived as a formal addendum titled, Final Authorization and Deployment Notice, Residential Visibility Standard Framework. This time there was an additional section I hadn't seen before, an explicit authorization record. It stated that the framework had completed its final HOA board ratification vote, followed by a formal legal review sign-off confirming compliance with municipal data sharing and residential governance standards. Only after that dual approval was the system marked as eligible for publication and deployment. That detail mattered, because it confirmed something I hadn't been able to see clearly before. This wasn't an organic shift. It was a staged authorization process, committee drafting to board ratification to legal validation to deployment approval, and now it had reached the final stage. Deployment. My property was listed again in the appendix, but the wording had changed slightly from earlier drafts. It was now labeled Approved Calibration Reference, Active Framework Definition Source. That phrase sat with me longer than anything else, because it no longer sounded like selection. It sounded like designation, not temporary use. Final assignment. Alongside the framework document was a publication certificate, confirming that the residential visibility standard had been formally issued as an active governing guideline for all properties under HOA jurisdiction, effective immediately upon publication authorization. That meant the system was no longer in development, no longer under review, no longer experimental. It had been deployed. The audit visit came the next morning. A small compliance team arrived again. Same composition as before. Architectural reviewers, measurement tools, structured diagrams. But the atmosphere felt different. Not procedural anymore. Finalized. They didn't introduce themselves beyond confirming they were performing a post-publication validation check for baseline stability verification. That phrasing made my stomach tighten, because it implied something I hadn't fully processed yet. They weren't testing my property. They were confirming the stability of a system that already depended on it. They began the same way. Sightline mapping, curb markers, angle checks. But this time the pace felt slower, more deliberate, like they weren't discovering anything new, just confirming what already existed in the published standard. I stood near the driveway again, watching them work. And for the first time, the thought didn't feel hypothetical. If something deviates here, does the framework change? Or do I just become the exception they design around? That uncertainty sat heavier than anything before, because now there was no next step I could influence, only system validation. They paused longer near the center of the driveway. One of them compared real-world measurements with the finalized framework diagrams on their tablet. No one spoke for several seconds. That silence felt different from earlier visits. Not uncertainty between people, but confirmation between system and reality. Then, one of them finally spoke. Calibration reference remains within approved variance parameters. A pause. Then, no adjustment required. Framework integrity confirmed. That should have felt like resolution, but it didn't feel like an outcome directed at me anymore. It felt like confirmation that I was no longer being evaluated as a subject. I was being used as a fixed point. They packed up their equipment without further discussion. No instructions, no follow-up, no mention of future review cycles. Only one final note was left in the system log they shared afterward. Framework status: active. Post-authorization stable deployment confirmed. That phrase mattered more than everything else, because it implied finality, not temporary stability, institutional stability. That afternoon, the final publication record was updated across all channels. The framework now appeared as an active, locked governance standard under HOA legal and municipal data compliance registration. No further revision cycle was listed, no review date scheduled, no override mechanism referenced, and my property remained listed in the appendix as the calibration reference used during final authorization, not as a live case, but as a locked definition source. That was when it fully settled. The conflict hadn't ended in resolution. It had ended in deployment. And once a system becomes deployed and legally stabilized across governance layers, it no longer changes based on the case that created it. After the final authorization notice, nothing changed anymore. Not because nothing was happening, but because nothing could be revised. The framework had entered a locked governance state. Officially registered under HOA legal adoption records and recognized in municipal planning systems as a stable reference standard. That meant it was no longer part of an active decision cycle. No updates, no revision requests, no rollback pathway, just institutionalized structure. In the weeks that followed, I saw the effect of that stability everywhere. Neighbors received classification reports, but they were no longer framed as reviews. They were framed as standardized baseline readings under an established system. Some people adjusted their properties, others didn't. But there were no disputes anymore. Because there was nothing left to dispute. Even enforcement language had disappeared. Not because rules were weaker, but because the framework had already absorbed interpretation into measurement. I kept the truck where it had always been. No new notices referenced it. No further evaluations occurred. Not because it was ignored, but because it had already been resolved into the system's baseline logic. That part stayed with me longer than anything else, because I wasn't being monitored anymore, and I wasn't being corrected anymore. I was simply part of a finalized reference structure that no longer required interaction. Over time, I noticed something subtle. New guidelines still appeared. Landscaping ratios, lighting alignment standards, frontage symmetry updates. But they no longer referenced individual cases for justification. They referenced the framework itself. That was the difference. The system no longer explained itself through me. It explained itself through its own published structure. And that meant the loop had closed. No new inputs would override it. No reversals were possible without dismantling the entire governance layer that now supported it. That was the final, stabilizing point. Not silence, not absence, but institutional finality, where the framework becomes part of governing architecture itself, not subject to revision from its origin case. I stood in the driveway one last time, looking at the same position that had started everything. Nothing about it had changed physically, but nothing about it could change structurally anymore either. And that realization carried a strange weight. Not closure, not victory, just permanence. Because once something becomes legally and institutionally locked into both HOA governance and municipal planning structure, the case that created it stops existing as a reference point for change, and only the system remains.